Welcome, everyone, and it's delightful to be back learning a Gesunte Zummer. The only simcha that I noted, and please correct me if I missed out anybody, was Yehudis Edelman's grandson, Bar Mitzvah, this week. Menachem Mendel, Ben Shmuel, and Shena. You should have endless Hasidic nachas, and we should all have Gesunte and Freilich nachas always. Okay, as has been the case the last few weeks, this is not exactly your Babi Sicha. But I'm going to try my best, and I'll be grateful for any help that anybody can give me. So here we go. So let's just talk a little bit about context. So this week's Parsha, Shemini, records what happened on the 8th day of the Miluim. The Miluim were the days of convocation or consecration or inauguration or orientation of the Mishkan. And there were various things that had to be done each day, and so on and so forth. And on the 8th day, which was the crescendo, there were numerous karbanos that had to be brought up, and this was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. One of the karbanos was a karban chatas for Rosh Chodesh. It's brought every Rosh Chodesh. But in addition, there were very specific karbanos that had to be brought up that day. And it was also the first day that the Nesiim inaugurated the Mizbeach. So just like before Pesach, we were saying the Nesiim from Rosh Chodesh Nisan every day. So this was the first day of that process of the Nesiim bringing their particular karbanos on the Mizbeach that was being initiated and oriented and consecrated for the first time. Now, as we all know, on that day, a very, very dramatic and, depending on how you understand it, terrible occurrence where two of Aaron's sons passed, as the Rebbe explains it, because their neshamas could no longer be contained in their bodies. They wanted to come closer to the Eibishter with such a tremendous longing and a yen and an insatiable thirst to be closer to the source that their neshamas left their bodies. So the upshot was that Aaron and his sons were in a state of aninus. Aninus is a very particular halachic paradigm which befalls the 7 closest relatives of the deceased, and it's the time between death and burial. And during that time, there are a lot of things that the relatives are not permitted to do. And this sicha revolves around a pasuk in our parsha and a halacha concerning a debate or an argument between Moshe and Aaron as to how Aaron and his sons should comport themselves vis-a-vis these karbanos, how Aaron saw it and how Moshe saw it. So the Rebbe is first going to explain the issue at hand, and then is going to take us into a few pluktas, a few back and forth debates and that are connected to this issue in the Gemara, and then is going to give us a hira for our lives. So the pasuk that we're starting with is in Perek Yud, pasuk Tezayin, 10:16. It's the first pasuk of the 5th aliyah of this week's parsha, Shemini. And the pasuk reads as follows: Ve'esir hachatas darash Moshe. And concerning the goat as a sin offering, Moshe repeatedly inquired about it. Vehine sarif, for it had indeed been burnt. And he became angry with Elazar and Isamar, Aaron's surviving sons, demanding them to respond. And his taina, his complaint to them, comes in pasuk Yud Zayin. Madua lo yachaltem es hachatas b'mkoim hakodesh. Why did you not eat the sin offering in the holy place? Now, this is one of the multiple sin offerings that were brought up. But concerning this one, which was a seir for Rosh Chodesh, he said, why didn't you eat it in the proper place? Ki kodesh kadoshim he, for it is holy of holies. And Hashem gave it to you to bear the community's transgressions, to atone for them before the Eternal. So how did you dare not eat it, even though you're in a state of aninus? And then he said in Pasuk Yudches, Hein loy huvas dam el kodesh. After all, its blood was not brought inside the kodesh, in which case that would have been a sin, and then the carbon has to be burned. But that was not the case here. So therefore, so you surely should have eaten it in the holy place, just as I commanded you previously. And then Aaron replied, look at Pasuk Yotes, Vayidaber Aaron and Moshe. Aaron then spoke to Moshe, and he said, Hein hayom hikrivu as chatasam. They, meaning Elazar and Isamar, they today brought up the sin offering, Ves Oiloisam, and their burnt offering, Lifnei Hashem, before Hashem, Vatikrena, and now this tragedy has happened. I'm sorry, I'm reading it wrong. He said, was it they that brought the burnt offering? It wasn't them. It was I that brought it. Vatikrena, and now, even if this tragedy had happened to me, Vatikrena Oisi Kaela, if this tragedy of death would have happened to me with other relatives, but other relatives that are close to me, but are not my sons, but are still my closest family, V'achalti chatas hayom, and I would have eaten the chatas of today, the one that you're talking about, the one from the Rosh Chodesh, hayitav be'eni Hashem, would have been pleasing in Hashem's eyes, meaning, rhetorical question. Aaron is telling Moshe, no, the halacha is not the way you're saying it. The halacha is that I'm not allowed to eat it. And the Sikha analyzes why was it that this korban they weren't allowed to eat from, but the other two karbanos they were? What is the difference in the nature of the karbanos? It's also going to bring us into understanding what the Gemara says versus what Rashi says about these types of karbanos, and also what Rashi says and what the Gemara says about how it is that Aaron knew this halacha and Moshe did not. And the Rebbe is going to look, as he does always, very, very carefully at the terminology. Okay, so now that we have the context, now let's go to Seif Aleph. Ala pasuk v'seir hachatas darash Moshe v'hinei seiraf. On this pasuk that we just read, again, pasuk Yud, that Moshe investigated concerning this chatas, the chatas of the Rosh Chodesh, and he found that it was burnt, meaning that it wasn't consumed, it wasn't eaten by Aaron and his children. Amru Chazal. So the Chazal, the Medrash, and the Gemara in Zvachim says, Shebeshmini lemiluim hikrivu Aaron uvanav shloisha seirei chatas. That on the 8th day, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, on the 8th day of the Miluim, on the 8th day of the orientation or initiation of the Mishkan, Aaron and his sons brought up 3 different karbanos chatas, 3 goats. Seir Izim, they brought up 1 goat because to mark that it was the 8th day. V'seir Nachshain, and they brought up 1 goat that was from the first of the Nesiim, Nachshain, who was the Nasi of Shevet Yehuda. V'seir Rosh Chodesh. And then they brought up the Seir, the carbon chatas that's brought every Rosh Chodesh. Umikulan loy nisreif elazeh. And the other 2 they ate, so it wasn't consumed via fire, wasn't burnt up. But this one they did not eat from. Which one was it? The Seir Rosh Chodesh, the goat to mark Rosh Chodesh. Va'al kain vayiktaf Moshe, and therefore Moshe became angry, and he said, Madua lo yachaltem es chatas gomer. Why did you not eat from this chatas? As we just read in Psukim, you have to give atonement for Bnei Yisrael. Why were you slacking on this? Ve'yeshivu Aaron, and Aaron answered to him, Hein hayom ikrivu es chatasam. Hein hayom ikrivu es chatasam. Sorry, it wasn't them that brought it up, it was me. Vatikrena, and then this terrible tragedy happened. And even if this tragedy would not have been my son's, it would have been with somebody else for whom I become a einin, va'achalti chatas hayom. And if I would have ate that chatas today, hayita be'eni Hashem, would that have been what Hashem wanted? Would that have actually found favor in the eyes of Hashem? I don't think so. Vayishma Moshe, and the Torah records in the next pasuk that Moshe heard what Aaron said, Vayitav be'enav, and it found favor in his eyes. So Moshe had a complaint, Aaron had a rebuttal, and as soon as Moshe heard what Aaron said, he accepted it, and he found favor in his eyes. Okay. Echad mibi'uri Chazal. So one of the explanations that Chazal give us in the Gemara, b'shakla v'tarya kan be Moshe la'Aaron, in this argument between Moshe and Aaron, is im hayat tzarich le'echal asir chodesh kikesol kal g'daytach shel Moshe oy l'sofer kedas Aaron. Okay, one of the explanations in this debate regarding if Aaron and his sons should have eaten the flesh of the Seir Resh Chodesh, as Moshe thought, or burn it, as Aaron thought, is like this. The Gemara explains, Aaron Ivanav hayu eininim ba'esa shah al yidei misas nadav avihu. Aaron and his sons were in a state of aninus at this moment. And again, aninus is that time, usually very, very short, between death and burial, and there are many, many things that are circumscribed at that time, and that's the state that Aaron and his sons were in. V'ainen asur b'kachim, and an einin is not permitted to eat from kachim, from those things that are consecrated to Hashem. Ella shebenegei l'seir izim v'seir nachshin hara Moshe, but when it came to the two chatas that were delineated first. One is because it was the 8th day of Miluim, and one was the first of the Nisim, the Seir of Nachshon, Hayra Moshe. About that, Moshe taught specifically va'achaltem, that they should be eaten, even though Aaron and his sons are in a state of aninus, but this is for the whole community. They have an obligation to eat it. Kichein tsuvesi, because that's Moshe says to Aaron, because that's how I was specifically commanded to do sabagat. Ba'aninus yechluha, that even though you're in aninus, you should eat it. Avo b'negei l'seir chodesh hayu chalukos hadeyos b'Moshe la'Aaron. So when Moshe told Aaron and his sons to eat it, okay, that was a clear command from Hashem. There was no discussion. But when it came to the third carbon, the third Seir Chatas, which was for Rosh Chodesh, here there was a difference of opinion. Moshe opined that they should eat from this third carbon as well, the one for Rosh Chodesh, just like they ate from the other two goats that were brought that day. So Moshe's opinion was that the day, because of the particular date on the calendar, that this was Yom HaShemini, so it excluded all of the karbanos from the regular halachos regarding aninus. That was Moshe's opinion. Ach Aaron lo savar kein, but Aaron saw a difference between the two, the Seir, because it was Yom HaShemini, and the Seir of Nachshon ben Aminadav of the Nesiim, to the one that was for Rosh Chodesh. And he said like this, V'heishiv l'Moshe, and he answered to Moshe, Shema lo shamata zeheter, ele b'katshei sha'ah. It seems to me that maybe you heard the heter, but it's only for what's called kachei sha'ah, which means karbanos that are brought up only at a very particular time. Later in the Sikha, the Rebbe is going to drill down further, and he's going to explain to us that there are actually two categories in kachei sha'ah. But for now, we're going to say that kachei sha'ah are karbanos that are brought up one time in history for a very particular reason. And so it was with the Seir Izim, which was brought up because it was Yom Hashmini of the inauguration or the orientation of the Mishkan, and the Seir of Nachshon, because that was a one-time deal in history that all of the Nesiim inaugurated the Mizbeach by bringing up karbanos. But when it comes to kache dairis, but when it comes to karbanos that are brought up in every generation, so here the Gemara brings down that Aaron said to Moshe, you have to make a comparison, a kal v'chomer mi meiser hakal, from meiser, which is much less stringent than kachim. Oma meiser hakal amra Torah lo yachalti ba'ayni mamayne. There was like a declaration that the Jews had to say when they had brought all of their meisers and trumas, and in that declaration they said, "Lo achalti ba'ayni mimenu." I did not eat in my time of aninus from these holy crops and whatever was put aside as meiser and truma. So the Gemara says that Aaron said to Moshe, we could learn that I definitely shouldn't have eaten the korban of the seir of the chatas for Rosh Chodesh from meiser. Meiser is less stringent than korbanos. And about meiser, it says in the Torah that one of the things the Jew had to declare is that I didn't eat of it when I was in aninus. So bekache dairis like kol shekain. So how much more so if you're talking about karbanos that would be brought up all the time, which have a more stringent halacha than meiser. So if you learn that if you can't eat from meiser when you're in einin, you for sure can't eat from a korban. That's l'dairis. A korban l'sha'a, a korban that was one time in history, that Hashem gave a special tzivui to Moshe. That's a different category. But this is going to be kachim dairis, right? This is going to be for Rosh Chodesh. Every Rosh Chodesh that we're going to bring up this korban. And no, Aaron says, I can't eat from that when I'm in aninus. How do I learn that? From a kal v'chomer to meiser, which is kal, which is much less stringent, which is more lenient. Umiyad, and immediately vayishma Moshe vayita be'enav. Immediately Moshe heard, and it found favor in his eyes. Moshe admitted he was not embarrassed to say lo shamati. He didn't obfuscate by saying, "Oh, I didn't hear that." Ella Amar, but rather he said, "Shamati v'shachachti." I heard this halacha and I forgot it. At this moment, this halacha was lost for me. It was obscured. I couldn't locate this halacha in my mind. Okay. That's the Gemara. Beis. Seif Beis. V'tzarech lahavin. We have to understand. Mipnei ma hutzrach Aaron loymar kal v'chomer mimeiser hakal chulei. Why did Aaron have to bring a proof for saying that you have to treat the korban of Rosh Chodesh different from the other two korbanos, one again for Yom Hashmini and one was from the first of the Nesiim? Why does he have to say de'i b'katshei dairis kal v'chomer mimeiser hakal? But when it comes to kachei dairis, which is different than kachei shah, okay? Kachei shah is the korban that has to be brought up because it's Yom Hashmini, and the second of those two korbanos from kachei shah is the nasi, the seir of Nachshon. But the korban for Rosh Chodesh was going to be something they would always bring on Rosh Chodesh. It's called kachei dairis. Why does Aaron have to bring a proof that kachei dairis is different from kachei shah by trotting out the kal v'chomer from the meiser, which is more lenient? Aaron loy ba l'chadesh l'Moshe sadin b'chlalosai she'oinin asur b'kachim. After all, it's clear from the context that Aaron wasn't coming here to teach something novel to Moshe generally about aninus. How do we know that? Because we see from the context of the Torah that Moshe knew about that. And in this particular incident, we see that. We have it because we see, you could look at it in Pasuk. Hold on a minute. Here in Pasuk Yud Ches, it says Kasher Tzivesi, as Hashem commanded me. So that means that Aaron's not coming to teach Moshe about the halacha v'aninus vis-a-vis karbonis in general. Heter mefurish b'negei l'shar hasi'irim shebaninus yechluhu. That there's going to be, because he told him that there's a specific heter, the specific allowance to eat the other seirim in a state of aninus. Ve'ilu kedei lahadgish as a chiluk bedavar shaheter miyuchad b'shas aninus amarak b'negei l'kachay shav v'lo b'negei l'kachay deires. And if all that Aaron wants to do is remind or teach Moshe that this allowance to eat karbanos, kachim, in aninus is only relevant to kachay sha'ah, to the two karbanos that were specific for that time in history, and it's not nageya, it's not relevant, the kachay deires, to the karban of Rosh Chodesh, which would be brought up for generations to come. In order to counter Moshe's svara, Moshe's opinion, Moshe's thesis that the heter, the allowance to eat of the karbanos, included all of the karbanos that were brought that day. So just to teach the distinction between kachay deires and kachay shah, the Rebbe says, why is it necessary for Aaron to bring the kal v'chomer from the meiser hakal? Why is it necessary to compare it to the fact that you're not allowed to eat meiser when you're in a state of aninus? And meiser is a much more lenient type of holiness than the karbanos. In other words, it's almost as if Aaron wouldn't have brought that proof, you wouldn't have been able to distinguish between kachay shah and kachay deires. The Rebbe says that's not the case, because kachay shah and kachay deires are clearly two different categories. And so why does Aaron feel compelled to trot out that comparison? What's the imperative for that to happen? Aaron could have said very quickly and in very succinct fashion, Shema shamata b'kachay shah v'lo b'kachay deires. Like Rashi actually says, maybe what you heard is just about kachay shah, is just about the karbanos that were brought up that one time in history, v'lo b'kachay deires, but it doesn't apply to the korban that's about Rosh Chodesh, because that would be l'dairis, because in every door that the Jews during the time of the Beis Mikdash Hayakayim would bring up a korban for Rosh Chodesh. And the Rebbe says, v'diuk zeh, and this specificity that the Gemara brings down, that Aaron brought a proof from Meiser to Moshe, boilet b'yeser says, stands out even more, al pi ma shematzinu b'perish Rashi al HaTorah, when you compare the Gemara to what Rashi does. Shehevi gam kein is teichen hashakal v'taya hanal, because Rashi also brings down this debate, this argument between Moshe and Aaron, by Moshe and Aaron, she'Aaron tan sheyesh kiluk ben kachay shah lekachay deires, that Aaron claimed or rebutted to Moshe, my older brother, there is a difference between kachay shah and kachay deires. There's a difference between the karbanos that were historic and were for just that junction in history, and the karbanos that would be brought up all the time. And indeed, Rashi gives us this, Shakal V'Taya gives us this debate very succinctly. He says, under the words Hayitav Be'enei Hashem, under those words in the pasuk, Would this have been pleasing in the eyes of Hashem? Rhetorical question. Aaron asked of Moshe. Rashi says, Im shamata b'katchei shah, ein lecha lahakel b'katchei deres. Just because you heard it about the karbanos that would be brought up just that time in history, you cannot infer from that to be lenient in kachei deres, in karbanos that would be brought up all the time. But look in the parentheses, the Rebbe says, Rashi brings down the shackle of Ataya, mibli lahaskir zakal v'choyim mima'asar hakal. But he does not mention what the Gemara does, that Aaron backed up his rebuttal with a proof from Meiser. And again, Meiser is kal. Meiser is the holiness of Meiser has a leniency about it as compared to karbanos. And if you're not allowed to eat that when you're an einain, how much more so you're not allowed to eat from karbanos when you're an einain. But Rashi does not include this. So the Rebbe now is going to look at the difference, parse the difference between these two texts and how it is connected to something else in the Gemara, etc. Gimel. V'yuvan, and we'll understand this, bahakdim, by prefacing diuk lashon Rashi hanal, the specificity of the terminology of the above-mentioned Rashi, and again the Rebbe cites it here, im shamata b'katchei shah, if you heard it about karbanos that were just for that one time in history, ein lach lahakel b'katchei deres. You don't have allowance to apply this leniency to karbanos that would be brought up for all time and all generations. Now the Rebbe says, Milashon Rashi, from this specific terminology, ein lach lahakel. Rashi says, you don't have allowance to be lenient. Rashi could have said, you cannot learn, you cannot infer, you cannot compare. There are so many ways in which Rashi could have said it, but he didn't say that. He said, ein lach lahakel. You can't be lenient based on this. But he could have said, you can't learn from this. That the two are not comparable. You can't learn from one to the other. It's not a comparison. But the fact that Rashi uses the term ein lach lahakel, you cannot be lenient, muchach, this proves shahatam she'ein ledamais kachei deres lekachei shahu. This proves that the reason you can't compare kachei deres are karbanos that would be brought up in all future generations, to kachei shah, to the karbanos that would just be brought up at that particular moment in history. Huloi mishum sheheta aninos bekachei shah hayahira shah shemimenu leinitan klal lilmoid lemokim acher. It's not because the permission to eat while in a state of aninus, the kachei shah, was just for that moment, hayra shah. It was just a singular hayra, a singular instruction for that moment, from which you cannot infer for anything after that. Ella, but rather, Rashi is opining, lefi shekachei daires chamurim yoser mikachei shah. Rashi is opining differently from Gemara. The Gemara is saying that kachei shah is chamor, is more stringent than kachei daires. That what happened at only a certain moment in history has a stringency about it that surpasses the stringency of karbanos that would be brought up all the time. And Rashi is opining the opposite, that kachei daires, that karbanos that would be brought up all the time, for all generation, chamurim yoser mikachei shah. They are more stringent than karbanos that would just be brought up at a certain time. And for that reason, im shamata bekachei shah ein lecha lahakel bekachei daires. And for that reason, Rashi is saying, just because you heard it about kachei shah, you cannot take that leniency and apply it to kachei daires, to karbanos that would be brought up in future generation. Okay. Va'al pizeh move on. Hatam shebegemara, and therefore we understand now the reason why the Gemara brings the additional words, Neisa b'divrei Aaron, the additional words of Aaron, kal v'chaymer mimasa hakal. That Aaron was bringing a proof from the fact that you can't eat meiser when you're in a state of aninus. And meiser is a more lenient type of holy food. So if you can't eat that when you're an Einan, then for sure you can't eat the kache deres. Why does the Gemara bring that down? Kilishitas hashas, because in the opinion of the Gemara, hare adarabba, it's the opposite of Rashi. Kache sha'a chamurim mikache deres. The karbanos that were only brought up at one singular moment in history are more stringent than the karbanos that would be brought up in all generations, which is the opposite of Rashi. And therefore, how much more so you could learn about that stringency from the fact that you couldn't eat meiser when you were in a state of aninos, and meiser has a less stringent holiness than kache deres. So for sure that's true here. The raya ladavar. And now, what's the proof for the Gemara's opinion? Okay, again, the Gemara's opinion is that kache sha'a, that karbanos that would be brought up at only one time in history are more stringent than the karbanos that we brought up for all time. What's the proof? The Gemara, Huva plukta ben Rabbi Yossi Haglili l'chachamim. The Gemara brings down an argument between Rabbi Yossi Haglili and the Chachamim and the sages, b'negei l'makar hadin, regarding the source of the halacha, shechatas chitzayna, that a korban chatas, whose blood had to be sprinkled on the mizbeach hachitzayin, the copper mizbeach that was in the azara, that was in the hechel, that was in the yard, the courtyard around the actual Mishkan. So that was a kind of chatas that the blood has to be sprinkled on that mizbeach. But if it happened, shenichnas dama lifnayu lifnim, that by mistake the blood was sprinkled on the mizbeach hapnim, it was sprinkled on the inside mizbeach, nifseles, it becomes pasul, v'tzrichas reifa, and it needs to be burnt. Nobody could eat from it; it has to be burnt. So the Rabbi Yossi Haglili lemedim came min akasov shebeparsha seinu hein loy huva es dama ela kodesh prima. Rabbi Yossi Haglili opines that we learned this halacha from the pasuk in our parsha, pasuk Yud Ches in Perek Yud. If you want to look at it, hein loy huva es dama ela kodesh prima. After all, the blood was not brought inside into the sanctuary. So you surely should have eaten it, b'kodesh, in the holy place, kasher tzivesi, just as I commanded you, based on Hashem's command to me previously about the other two karbanos. Moshe saying to Aaron, why are you not eating from this karban? I know that it wasn't made invalid by the blood being sprinkled in the wrong place. Therefore, it should not have been consumed by fire completely. Should have been eaten. Why didn't you eat it? So Rabbi Yossi Haglili says you bring down that's the pasuk that teaches about this halacha. Hainu, in the parentheses, sheshe'elas Moshe la'aron hi lama nisraf korban achatas b'shah shedamei loy huva ela kodesh prima. Why was this korban burnt instead of you and your sons eating from it? That would only happen if the blood was sprinkled in the wrong place. And I know that the blood was not sprinkled in the wrong place. Meklal de'i ayil dama b'sreifa. If the blood would have been brought in the wrong place, then it would have had to be burnt. Omikan lamanu, and from this we learn l'chol chatas chitzayna. We learn this for any time that you have a korban chatas, a sin offering, that the blood has to be sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, but by mistake shenichnas dama lefnai lefnim, but for some reason the blood was sprinkled on the inner mizbeach, shedina b'sreifa, that you have to burn the rest of the korban. Aval chachamim lamdu dinze because mikas of acher. But the Chachamim, the sages, learned this from a different pasuk. Rashi, like Rashi explains, Shaladas Chachamim, ef shalil meitzais min akasov. You can't learn anything from this pasuk in our parsha, pasuk Yud Ches and pasuk in Perek Yud, lefi shedares misha lo yalpinun, because we can't learn for karbanos that would be brought up throughout the generations for all time. We cannot learn it from something singular, from this event that was l'shah, that was just for this moment. Okay, so that's the plukta in the Gemara between Rabbi Yossi HaGlili and the Chachamim regarding this scenario of the blood being sprinkled in the wrong place and where you learn the halacha from. Ulechayra, and the Rebbe says, because remember, he's bringing down this plukta to help us understand the plukta between Aaron and Moshe. Ulechayra, the Rebbe says, seemingly, even if we cannot draw an inference from what happened here, but still, what's the imperative to make the halachas concerning a korban sha'ah different from l'dairis? Why is it different? What's the distinction? Umikan muchach, and from here it's proven. Shalashitas chachamim. Okay, wait. I have to give now. I have to just give a little bit of an introduction. Okay, confusion alert. But it's only confusing until we understand this. This is confusing in the next two paragraphs. The Rebbe is going to explain this. That up until now, we were calling the other two karbanos sha'ah, the korban that was brought up for Yom Hashmini and the korban of Nachshon ben Aminadav, and we were calling the korban for Rosh Chodesh l'dairis, right? Yes, not? That was until now. That was the distinction, okay? But now we're going to come into from a different angle. The Sa'ir Rosh Chodesh of this time can also be referred to as Kachei Sha'ah, can also be referred to as a korban that was brought up at a singular moment, because of which Rosh Chodesh it was. Okay, and so the Gemara is going to address it as such, and so we have to first preempt this so we don't get confused. Okay, so now let's go back inside. Ubikan muchach shalashitas chachamim kachei sha'ah bichlal chamur mikachei dairis. So from this we understand from the argument between Rabbi Yossi HaGlili and the Chachamim. And the L'das Chachamim, remember, the sages opined that you can't learn anything from this event in history for later. So the Rebbe says, from this we've proven that the Chachamim are opining that Kachei Shah will always be more stringent than Kachei Dairis. V'lachein. Af al pi shenemar b'meforish Kachei Shah shechatas shenichnas dam lefnai lefnim dina b'sreifa adayin efshar hayolomer shekachei dairis ein dinu chamor k'moisem l'schaya b'sreifa. But if you're going to call this korban that was brought up for Rosh Chodesh Kachei Shah, you're going to give it singular importance. It belongs in a category of its own. You're going to apply Kachei Shah to it as well. The Chachamim opine that you can't infer anything from this to Kachei Dairis, to a korban that would be brought up for a Rosh Chodesh that would come in later generation. Because why? That's never going to have as stringent as a halacha as Kachei Shah. V'yisera mizu, and here the Rebbe explains, and even more, hakavana b'shah haniskar sham. What the Gemara means when it says shah, kachei shah, in this argument between Rabbi Yossi HaGlili and the Chachamim, Eina lekatshe shah kipshutam. It doesn't mean katshe shah in the pedestrian conventional sense. Hainu karbana shehukruvu rak ba'isa shah. Meaning, like when we started the Sikha, when we were using the term katshe shah, we were talking about a korban that would be brought up only once in history. Here, the Gemara is using katshe shah even on the korban for Shchaidesh, which would be brought up later in history, but still, at this moment, it was singular. Sharei hakorban shedanuhu l'sreifa hayusara Rosh Chodesh canal. The Rebbe says, because we know what it's talking about. It's talking about the Sarah for Rosh Chodesh. And that was going to be brought up for Darius. But it's still called Shah. Ela Kabir HaTaisvos. But like Taisvos explains in the Gemara, Lekach Shehayra Shah Haisa. Because there was a singular instruction from Hashem about what happened on this day. So therefore, it's called Katshe Shah. Because of Hayra Shah B'Katshe Darius. Okay, and you cannot infer from this, and you can't import from this chatas for Rosh Chodesh to any other chatas for Rosh Chodesh. V'nimtza. So what do we find from all of this? So how does this all shake down? Shalashitas Chachamim, that if you go according to the opinion of the Chachamim, in Yanei Shah Chamurim min Yanei Dairis. That's clear. The Chachamim are saying that anything that is only l'sha'a, that is singular, that was only for one time in history, is always going to be more stringent than something that was done afterwards for all generations. Ad kedei kach, so much so, she'afilu misha shebekatshe dairis, that even in this category of the sa'ir for Rosh Chodesh, which was a katshe dairis, which would be brought up all the time later, as long as the Beis Hamikdash was Kayam, but still within this category, there was this Soyer Rosh Chodesh Shemini Limiluim. There was this korban that was brought up for Rosh Chodesh, but it was part of the Miluim. It was on the 8th day of the Miluim, and therefore it's so stringent. The halacha efshar lilmoid. You can't learn anything from it for subsequent generations. Lefisha chamura hi mikatshe dairestam. Because this katshe dairis has a greater stringency than the subsequent katshe dairis. It's true, it's the same korban, brought up for the same purpose, Rosh Chodesh. But here the Gemara is calling this subsidiary of katshe dairis, the Chachamim is calling him, the Chachamim are calling it katshe sha'a. This one korban chatas for Rosh Chodesh that was brought up on Rosh Chodesh Nisan Shmini Lemiluim. Ve'im kain alachas kama v'kama shekatshe shah mamash. So how much more so katshe shah, the sa'ir, because it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan Lemiluim, and the sa'ir from Nachshain chamurim mikatshe dairis, are much more stringent than karbanos that would be brought up in subsequent generations. And once we understand that according to the Gemara, based on the Shakal B'Tari between Rav Yossi HaGlili and the Chachamim, Katshe Shah are more stringent than Katshe Dairis. So the Gemara cannot opine like Rashi, that if you heard something about Katshe Shah, you cannot learn from that a leniency for Katshe Dairis. Shechein Adra, because it's the opposite. Imatzinu b'Katshe Shah chamurim hakula deheter achila, because according to the Gemara, Katshe Shah are always more stringent than Katshe Dairis, right? So you can't use what Rashi is using, because imatzinu b'Katshe Shah hachamurim hakula deheter achila, because if vis-a-vis Katshe Shah, which the Gemara opines are always going to be more stringent than Katshe Dairis, you found a leniency. You found a heter to eat it ba'aninos when you're an einin. Al achas kama v'kala kama. How much more so shekula zu this leniency heter achila ba'aninos yachlu tachul b'katchei darish v'isamaymad. How much more so it should apply to the kachei darish of that particular day. That would have been the svara. That would have been the logical conclusion. Ulafichach, and therefore niskak Aaron lahaisiv, and that's why Aaron had to hasten and add the ibikache dayas kavachamim masar hakal. That how do we learn this? We learn this from a kal v'chomer with meiser, and meiser is more kal, is more lenient than the karbanos. So if you can't eat meiser when you're an einin, then you for sure can't eat the karban. Once we see that in the Torah, you're not allowed to eat meiser when you're an einin, even though the halacha regarding meiser is less stringent, is more lenient. So therefore, we would never learn from kachei shah a leniency for kachei dairis, because meiser is more lenient than kachei dairis, and you're not allowed to eat that when you're an einin. But rather, you have to say that this was a one-time leniency for that time, and you can't learn anything from it. Okay. Dalit. Now the Rebbe says, "Avaladayin in a move on. Ma hezber leplukta zu. Im kachi daris chamurim yoser keshitas Rashi, I kachi shah keshitas Hashaf." But now let's get into it. What is so now that we know that there's a plukta, that there's an argument, what drives this argument? The Chachamim never had arguments because they were bored or they were looking to score points, right? There has to be the essence of the argument. What's the essence of the argument as to which one is more stringent? Karbanos that would be brought up all the time for all generations, which is Rashi's opinion, or karbanos that would be brought up one-time basis, which is the opinion of the Gemara. And the Rebbe brought in Seif Gimel the whole Shakel V'Tarya of the Gemara between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the Chachamim to prove that according to the Gemara, it's definitely that karbanos shah are more stringent than karbanos l'dairos. The yesh loymar, and the Rebbe says we might say, which again is code for the Rebbe now rolling out a huge chiddush, sha'pluktahi, that the content of the argument is loy ma chomor yoser kanal. It's not about what is more stringent, ki'im, but rather eze sug kodshe shah hayakan. But rather, the argument or the difference of opinion is about what type of kodshe shah are we talking about here? Because the Rebbe says, "B'kodshe shah yeshnei oifanim." Because in the larger category of kodshe shah, which means karbanos that were brought up only one time, in that category there are two subsidiaries. There are two different modalities of kodshe shah. Aleph. The first is what the Rebbe is calling kodshe shah stam. Conventional kodshe shah. What does that mean? Chad pa'ami mamash. Literally one off, one time. Chad pa'ami in conventional Hebrew is like disposable plates. Like this was one time use. Like, the Rebbe is going to bring an example, but at first he says, L'loi pu'ula etzad hashava l'dairos. There's never going to be anything that you could compare to this in future generations, and there is no continual effect. What's an example of this? An example, al derech hakabana shehikriv Eliyahu Bahara Carmel. Exhibit A is what Eliyahu did on Har Carmel. Asher mistaber sheim kachei shah hakala mikachei dayers. And about this, we would say, logically, that they have less stringency than karbanos that were brought up all the time. Ukamay b'dugma hanal karbanos Eliyahu b'Har Carmel, shehuta behem isu shchutei chetz. Chutz, I'm sorry, shchutei chutz. Like we know, for example, that what Eliyahu did was a one-off anomalous thing, and about his karbanos, they were permitted to be shechted outside of Temple Mount of Har Habayis, even though there was an organized place to be karbanos at the time, and there were no more bumais. But what Eliyahu did was Hayra Shah. It was a one-time thing. That's one kind of kachei shah. And those, everybody would agree, have less stringency than kachei dayers. But then there's a different type of kachei shah base. Kachei shah, there's karbanos that fall into the category of kachei shah for one time. However, shakravasim b'poel hi omnam ba'isa shah bilvad. The Rebbe says it's true that practically bringing them up only happened one time. Avol in yanam v'toichnam hu pu'ula l'dayres. But their content and their idea and their effect endures for generations. Okay, so again, the Rebbe is saying that in the term or in the category kachei shah, there are two ways of understanding kachei shah. There are two subcategories. One is a one-off event that never happened again and had no effect on how things would be done in the future, like Eliyahu b'Har Carmel, those karbanos. Then the Rebbe says there's karbanos that were in fact only brought up once in history, but their effect was global. Their effect was overarching. Al derech ha-karbanos dimei hamiluim shechinchu es hamishkan. Like the karbanos we're talking about now, the karbanos of Yemei HaMiluim, whose content and whose reason was to be mechanech, to inaugurate the Mishkan. Val derech zeh karbanos hanesiim lechanukas hamizbeach. And in like manner, the karbanos that the Nesiim brought up that inaugurated the Mizbeach. The kachei shah misug zeh can move on, and this type of kachei shah itself understood chamurim yoser mikachim stam kachei dayres. This type of karban shah is more stringent than the karbanos that we brought up for all generations. Lefi sha'al yadam nif'alim ubehem tluyim in yanam l'dares, because through these karbanos shah was affected, and upon them is dependent the whole trajectory of karbanos that would be brought up for all generations until we no longer had a mikdash. And now that the Rebbe has brought this chiddush that in karbanos shah, there's two types of karbanos shah. Now he says val derech zeh benidun tidan kufa. Now we can apply this to what we are studying here. B'negeya l'seir izim v'seir nachshain shebegidram kekachei shah yitachnu shnei ofanim. So, regarding the seir izim and the seir nachshain, the one that was brought from the miluim and the one that was brought from the nesiim, that in that category of kachei shah, it could be understood in two ways. It could be understood in two ways. It's taka, a very specific type of kachei shah, but now this itself can be understood in one of two ways. Ubahakdim. And we have to preface this, that the two sides of the argument here between Aaron and Moshe, let's remember, the argument is not about if you bring the karban on the mizbeach. Ela b'negeya la'achilas ha'kohanim. The shakal v'tarya, the argument is only about if the kohanim eat or don't eat from it. Ubazeh yesh lachkar. And in that particular detail, if the karbanos should eat or not, here you can debate. Im gam achilas kahanim hi chelek mechanukas hamishkan v'hamizbeach. Here you can debate if the kohanim eating from it is imperative to the effect that this korban would have on inaugurating the Mishkan and the Mizbeach. I just want to repeat this point one more time. The Rebbe says, first he says that there's two types of katshe shah, okay? One is mamish, a one-off thing that has no effect on what happens later in history at all. And then you have the katshe shah that we are talking about in this sikha that had a tremendous effect because they inaugurated the Mishkan and the Mizbeach until the end of time. Now the Rebbe says, once we understand that, now let's talk about which detail is being debated here. We're not debating if the korban should be brought or not. All three korbanos were brought, and many others were also brought. The debate is about if Aaron and his son should eat from it. So what's the heart and soul of the debate? If their eating from it was imperative to the lasting effect that these katshe shah would have, is it actually imperative that they eat from it to effectuate what has to happen through these karbanos for the continuance of history until the end of the Batei Mikdash. So the Rebbe says like this: Al derech hapshat, if you want to talk pshat like Rashi does, mistaber shachilas b'nei adam hakahanim ein la kol shaychus lechinuch hamishkan v'hamizbeach. If you want to talk pshat, then you have to say, nah, it's not logical to say that their eating of it is imperative to the chinuch of the Mishkan and the Mizbeach, the inauguration of the Mishkan and the Mizbeach. What's imperative is that the korbanos should be brought. If the Kohanim eat from it or not so important on the everlasting effect of these korbanos. Certainly, the Sir Izim for the 8th day of Miluim. Hainu korban shehu b'chlal achinuch dimei hamiluim. This is the korban that was because it was the days of inauguration of the Mishkan. Shari azman hamidubar eis achilas hasahir hu la'achar shekabonos Aaron kvar palu al yidei hakravosam al gabei mizbeach as a chinuch, because eating from it was after Aaron brought these karbanos, and it was the bringing of the karbanos that actually precipitated the inauguration of the Mishkan. Ubishlei Musay. And it was done fully. And how do we know this? Moshe had already validated this and ratified this by saying that because of these karbanos, the Shechina is going to rest here. So it seems that whatever effect has to happen through these karbanos has already taken place. And once they actually saw the fire come down from heaven and consume these offerings, so al pshat, whether they're going to eat from it or they're not going to eat from it, doesn't seem to have a great effect. The inauguration of the Mishkan already happened. The Shechina rested, the fire came down, and so they're eating al pshat, not so important. Elafilu seir nachshain, and this is not just. The Rebbe says certainly this was concerning the sa'ir for the miluim, but even the sa'ir for nachshan, shebay haisas chalosh shneim asar yimei chanukas hamizbeach lidei karbanos hanesiim. Nachshan's korban was the first in a series of 12 that would inaugurate the Mizbeach. Okay, the earlier korban was about inaugurating the Mishkan. This is about inaugurating the Mizbeach. Hari lefi derech hapshat. But if you go with the simple interpretation, mistaber loimer, it's logical to say shechanukas hamizbeach shura la'akravos al gabe hamizbeach b'Mishkan ach loy lachilas hakahanim. That inaugurating the Mizbeach has to do with the karbanos that are brought on the Mizbeach, not the eating on the part of the Kohanim. It's not seminal to it. V'nimtza, and so we find Shalashita's perish Rashi Elatayra Achilas HaKahanim B'Kachisha Eina Negas L'Dayis. So Rashi is taking the opinion that the eating from Kachisha is not relevant to the effect on future generations. Elohi inyan chad pami. It's a one-time thing. Hainu shehi pesuk harishon shebekachisha hakal mikachideres. It actually falls into the first category of kachisha, which are less stringent than kachideres, and that is an event that happens, a one-time thing. Again, I want to make sure we understand the bringing of the korban on the mizbeach. That falls into the second category. It's a kachi, it's a korban that's brought l'shah, but it has an effect on all the generations. Therefore, it's more stringent than kachi dairis. But Rashi is embracing the opinion that the eating, not the bringing of the korban, but the eating of the korban falls in the category of kachi shah that don't have an effect on later generations. Umamela b'lashon Rashi, im shamata ba'aninus yachlu b'kachisha. So according to Rashi, Aaron said to Moshe, if you heard from Hashem that you're allowed to eat in aninus kachisha hakalim that are more lenient, ein lecha lahakel b'kachi daris hachamurim. But you can't learn from this about the kachi daris that are chamurim, that are more stringent. Can't do it. Masha'en came b'limud al derech halacha, but not so if you're learning like the Gemara al derech halacha. Okay, so Rashi is trying to tell us pshat. The Gemara has come to teach us halacha. Hare kishem shematzinu b'negei lekapara sh'al yidei korban. Just like we found. Okay, according to the Gemara is teaching that just like we found that the atonement that comes from a korban in general, shekehanim oichlim ubalim mischaprim. Okay, the Gemara tells us, and Rashi brings, not the Gemara, the Medrash tells us, and the Gemara and Rashi brings down in our parsha that by the kohanim eating from the korban, the Baal HaKorban, the person that brought the korban, got a kapara. Al derech zehu lefi derech halacha b'negei lechol ha'pa'ula she'al yidei korban. So the Rebbe says, al pi halacha, you have to infer from this that everything that happens with the korban is part of the atonement for the Baal. Koilel pa'ulas ha'karbana she'benid nidan, so that includes even the eating thereof. Chinuch hamishka v'mizbeach she'achilas ha'kohanim afhi po'eles chizuk v'toisefes be'inyan. The Gemara is teaching that Aaron and his sons eating from the korban solidified and strengthened the pa'ula, the effect of the korbanos that were brought here, l'dairis, on all future generations. V'nimtza. And so if we're taking that opinion, then we must say, shagam achilus kohanim b'sari izim b'sari nachshin nagas l'dairis, that even the eating from them had an effect to generation. V'lachein shitas hashasi, and therefore the Gemara opines shekache shah elu, that this type of kache shah that has an effect for generations to come, chamurim yosem mikache daires, are more stringent than the karbanos that would be brought up for every generation. Ulafichach, and therefore niskak Aaron lekal v'chayim maser hakal, and therefore Aaron had to bolster his position by drawing the Kal V'chomer to the halacha of Meiser, which is always more lenient even than Katshe Dair, as said above. Okay. Hey. Now in Hey, the Rebbe is going to circle back to Moshe's reaction, and how Rashi describes Moshe's reaction, and how the Gemara describes Moshe's reaction to the words of Aaron. Hey, al pi habir ha'amor b'chiluk shebein shitas hashas shitas Rashi. So based on the above stated difference between Rashi and the Gemara, Beperusha ala Torah, bevir tainas Aaron, in Rashi's beer on the Torah, in what Aaron was explaining to Moshe. Yuvan gam hashunu b'neiim b'negei lahidas Moshe vayishma Moshe vayita be'enav. We're going to understand also the difference between Rashi and the Gemara when it comes to explaining Moshe's reaction to Aaron's rebuttal. The Gemara Amru, in the Gemara it says, Haida v'loy boish Moshe loymar l'shamati, ela amar shamati v'shachachti. That Moshe was not embarrassed, and therefore he didn't obfuscate by saying, I never heard this. He said, I heard it and I forgot. Hainu, shahaisa itzel Moshe shikcha. This means that this was one of 3 times where Moshe forgot something. This was forgetfulness. Masha Inke, a contradistinction, Rashi b'Perushai ala Torah. When Rashi explains what happens here, Nakat loy lashon hashas el al derech lashon Torah zakahanim. Rashi cites not from the Gemara but from the Medrash, which says Hoida v'loy bash. He acknowledged, he admitted, he was not embarrassed, loymar, to say loy shamati. I never heard this. Upashtas lashon Rashi he. Now, a simple explanation of what Rashi is saying is, Commotion is Barba Makam Achar Barucha, the Rebbe says, like I explained in a different place at great length, L'Kotei Sichos Chelek Ches, Sheloi Hayabosh Ella Amar Sheloi Shama Mekadosh Baruch Hu. He wasn't embarrassed. He didn't try to deny. He said, I didn't hear this from Hashem. I didn't hear from Hashem, Chiluk Zeh Ben Kachi Shah L'Kachi Daris. I didn't hear that Hashem should explain that there's a difference between Kachi Shah and Kachi Daris. V'loi shahisakan shikha. But it's clear from Rashi's words that this was not a case of forgetfulness. V'yesh loymar dilashitasayu ozli. This was one of the things the Rebbe did all the time to explain that Rashi always veers towards a certain direction. He's consistent with how he explains things. The Gemara is consistent in how it explains things. L'shitas hashas, if you're going to go according to the opinion of the Shas, shekol yisaydi shel Aaron hu akal v'chaimim maser hakal, the Gemara explains that Aaron's rebuttal was based on a kal v'chaimer, on juxtaposing this against meiser, against the halacha that you're not allowed to eat meiser when you're an einin. And Meiser is in general more lenient than Kachim. So Aaron said, how much more so we can't eat from the Kachim. Because if not for this Kal V'chomer, if you're just going by theory, then even Aaron would have said, yes, I have to eat the Soyer Rosh Chodesh in Aninus, just like I had to eat from the other 2 goats. The Mikol Shekei Mikotche Shah Chamurim. And you learn this from how much more so, because Hashem said to eat the Kache Shah, which are more stringent usually, how much more so I have to eat the Kache Daris. But Aaron was not basing his rebuttal on anything but this halacha, the Kal V'chomer from Meiser. So based on that, Tzarech Leimer Shatam Shemoshe Lo Savar Kei Milechatchila Hu Mepnei Sheb'Shas Meiser Lo Yada Salimad Mimeiser Hakal. So we have to say that the reason why Moshe had a different opinion was because at that moment he did not know this halacha. V'shikcha ha'isakan, and he forgot it. Shenishkach mi Moshe Rabbeinu dina shel maaser v'halimud mimenu. At that moment, Moshe did not remember this halacha of Meiser and what can be implied from that, like Aaron did. That's the Gemara. So the Gemara says Moshe forgot. Masha ein kain, in contradistinction, leperish Rashi ala Torah, but Rashi doesn't say Moshe forgot. Rashi said he wasn't embarrassed to say, I never heard this. According to Rashi, the difference between Moshe and Aaron's opinion was not based on a halacha. It was based on a way of understanding things, on svara, on outlook, not an actual din which could be forgotten. Moshe hayasavor sheheta aninus hayakasher liyoim zeh. Moshe's thesis was that the allowance to eat an aninos was not contingent on what kind of korban, it was contingent on what day it was being eaten. Since it was all being eaten on that one day, the allowance is global. The heter is global. All the korbanos should be eaten of by the Kohanim, by Aaron and his sons. It was all bitur Shemini l'miluim, because it was the 8th day of Miluim. Umemela ein kol chiluk b'davar bein kachi shal lekachi dairis. For Moshe, it's about the day. It's not about the category of korban. That's his svara. That's his thesis. Va'al kach chidesh Aaron, and so Aaron came and he taught his brother something novel. Sheheter aninus eina ela karbonos hamiyuchodim liyoim zeh mitzad hayesa mimei hamiluim. That you're right that there's a difference in what day it is, but it's only the karbonos that are connected to this day and this day alone, which would mean the sa'ir that was because it was Yom HaShmini, and the sa'ir from Nachshon. But you cannot infer this heter, this leniency for a shchedesh, which would become a korban that you have to bring for all time. And therefore Rashi did not say Moshe forgot. Why? You can't say about a way of understanding things you forgot. It's not about forgetting a detail. It's about how you understand it. Is it possible that because a person forgot something, they're going to opine differently than somebody else's thesis? It's not about a detail. It's about an outlook. It's possible to forget a particular halacha. Al derech alma mimena halacha. This happened another 2 times, that there were halachas that were shrouded, that were hidden from Moshe. Aval ein makam lamashe svara nishkecha. You can't say that a svara, that a thesis, that a way of understanding things was forgotten. Titachin rak tos b'svara. The only thing you could say is it's a mistaken thesis. It's a fallacious thesis. Ach lo shikha. But you can't talk about forgetting when it comes to svara. The ein zeis elulafi pshuta shel mikra. But this is all if you're looking at the shot of the Torah, like Rashi does. Moshe amar lo shamati, shelo shama mekadosh baruch hu chiluk zeh. Moshe said, I never heard from Hashem this distinction. And when Aaron taught him, vayitev hadavar, then Moshe accepted it. He acknowledged that he never heard this, acknowledged that Aaron taught him this. Okay, now we can all take a deep breath. For sure, I am taking a deep breath, getting into more familiar territory. Mikol inyan yesh lilmod hara b'avodas ha'adam. From everything, we can learn a hara. We can learn a lesson. V'yesh leima hara me'inyan hanal. And we might say that the lesson from what we've been discussing, begoidel hazehiros hanidreshes binyanim shehin bedugmas kache shah. The Rebbe says we're going to focus on understanding the uniqueness and the stringency that surrounds kache shah, holy things, karbanos, that are a one-time deal. The Rebbe says like this: there are things in our spiritual service that fall into the category of kachei dairis, karbanos that were brought for all generations. Every Rosh Chodesh there was a sa'ir, there was a goat that was brought up as a karban chatas, which is fascinating. That karban, Hashem says, is a sin offering that you're bringing to give me atonement for my sin of making the moon smaller than the sun. But I digress. That is like unbelievable in Chassidus, but not for now. But the Rebbe says that there's, in Avodas Ha'adam, in spiritual service, there's things that we're always, for all dairas, for all times. Inyanim, kvuim, hakayamim, midor, dar b'li shinoi. These are things you do in every generation. There's no change. But then, v'yeshna minyanim b'dugmas kachesha. But then you have things that are for certain times in history. Inyanim chadashim, shetalmud vasik asid l'chadesh. These are new things that a tzaddik, that a nasi, that a very great sage teaches something novel. Takanais gedele Yisrael shv'hutzrach behen ba mitzadrishas hasha. These are enactments that the great monks B'nai Yisrael enacted because it was something that was called for at that time. I think it's about Rava that the Gemara says, Bika Matzah, he found a chasm, he found a valley, meaning he found something that was open and dangerous, the Godar Bageder, and he fenced it in. Okay, it's a bizarre. So we're very, very familiar with this. Asu siyag latayra. You have to make a fence around things. And there are so many things in halacha that fall into this category of a siyag. Okay. Now the Rebbe says, B'dvarim shebehem horgelu b'nei Yisrael midar dar. When you're talking about things that all of B'nai Yisrael are used to, because for generations we've been doing the same thing, ein kol kach kushoim b'nitzachana yitzahara. So when it comes to those things that have been being done for generations, so it's not so difficult to win over the Yetzer Hara because it's not a new thing. We already passed over kalas kashes. All beginnings are difficult, but it's not a new thing. So we're past that state of difficulty. And we can hopefully win over the Yetzer Hara when it comes to those things. V'yiseir mizeh. And even more so, hergel nasa teva. What you do on a constant basis becomes natural. We're creatures of habit. So we're used to this. We've been doing this for generations. Our parents did it, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-great. This is what Jews have been doing for generations. But when it comes to spiritual services that are in the category or in the paradigm of Kachei Shah, they're new. They're novel teaching for that time. The Yetzer Hara stands with great strength and opposes it and claims, Ma yom yamayim. What is today different from yesterday and the days before? The custom of our fathers was not in this novel way, v'chule. And the Rebbe says, kind of tongue-in-cheek, the Yetzer Hara positions himself as if he's the manik, he's the leader of the generation, he is the paisek, he's the halachic adjudicator of this generation, and he's the one that's going to establish what Jews should do now or not. And therefore the Rebbe says, drawing on what we've been discussing, how something that is a kachei shah, that falls in the category of kachei shah, that was only a one-time thing, which in and of itself, there's two categories, but the newer it is, and the more it's going to have effect on the future, the trajectory of the Jewish people, the more there has to be zehirus yisera. There has to be great care. There has to be great stringency. You have to be punctilious in this. In anything new, and especially if this is going to have an effect on future generations, you have to be much more careful, much more careful than you have to be with the things that we have been doing for generations and generations that are kind of parallel. The Rebbe is paralleling them to Kachei Dairis, to the carbonis that were brought up in all times and all generations. And we learned this from what the Gemara teaches. That the eating of these kachei shah, when Aaron and his sons were in a state of aninos, and in contradistinction, the burning of the carbon, they're not eating from the katshe dairis. That was a halacha that they were taught only for that day. Aval haseder haragil tzarich liyes b'ofen hafoch. Shekatshe shah kashim yoser amemelech hamurim yoser mekatshe dairis. They were permitted to eat it, but that was a hiras shah. But usually you have to be much more strict with something that's katshe shah from katshe, that as opposed to katshe dairis. Afilu b'makam shehutra achilas katshe dairis adayan ein mikach raya shemuta le'echel katshe shah. Even when they were given permission to eat katshe dairis, let's say that would have been the case, you still wouldn't have been able to infer from this that you're allowed to eat katshe shah. Katshe shah are always going to be more stringent. And we find that regarding the karbanos that were brought up in the days of the Miluim, that the first carbon that Aaron brought up, not a chatas seir, not a goat, but a par, a bull, loy achal kedin chatas kachidaris. He did not eat from it, like is the halacha regarding kachidaris. Ela tisra be'esh. He burnt it completely. V'tama davar. And what's the reason? Kevan shebekachidaris. Because when you're talking about something that's done all the time for all generations, she'ein hayitzahar misnagid lehem ad kedei kach. So the Yetzer Hara doesn't put that much emphasis, because the Rebbe teaches us constantly that Yetzer Hara comes where it's going to be successful. It comes to find the Achilles heel, the most convenient and vulnerable port of entry. So something that we've been doing for ages, for generations, Yetzer Hara is not going to waste its time, because you're already washing negavasa in your sleep, even if you only slept 1 hour and you're mamish sleepwalking, you're still going to wash negavasa because you've done that all the time. So therefore, in such a category, so when you're talking about something where you're not vulnerable to the Yetzer Hara's overtures, here you can allow yourself to enjoy eating from the carbon, as it were. You can allow yourself some leniency. Because after all, eating from the carbon, why is it not allowed when you're an einin? Because that is the most concentrated, intense, potent category in mourning, and you're not allowed to have any pleasure then. So the Rebbe says that generally speaking, something that we've been doing and we're not so worried that the Yetzer Hara is going to come and try to break us, we can allow ourselves a little bit more leniency, like eating from it in aninos. But when it comes to katshe shah, when it comes to a new thing, where the Yetzer Hara is pouncing on this, because the Yetzer Hara wants to mix us up and wants to try to weaken us. You have to be very, very careful and very stringent not to eat from it, metaphorically. Okay, this is it's very strong words here. And I don't think that we are so mahadir in this, but Hasidim of yore, and we know from the Hayom Yom, the Rebbe says, not just because it's permitted, it doesn't mean you should do it, right? What's impermissible, what's prohibited, for sure you're not allowed to do. And what's permissible, it's better that you shouldn't do. That was always by Hasidim, to weaken the Yetzer Hara, to weaken the hold that the Yetzer Hara has on us, not to give in to indulgences. So the Rebbe says that when it comes to an aspect of spiritual service where we are more vulnerable to the overtures of the Yetzer Hara, we have to be more stringent with that. We can't allow any pleasure because pleasure, again, metaphorically, right, allegorically, the pleasure of eating the kain eating from the karban, because that gives achiza, that gives strength and a stronghold to the Yetzer Hara. And that's why the whole carbon has to be burnt completely. Zion. And now the Rebbe says something unbelievable. The Rebbe says, and this is in general, Ahira, and now Ahira for our era specifically. Al Pikal Hasimonim, our Dar Hashvi, based on all the Simanim Shebasayf Maseches Saita. At the end, and now I'm just going to assume that the Rebbe is bringing in Saita because now is the time to learn Gemara Saita. So the Rebbe is not just bringing a footnote, but in the Pnim, the Rebbe is saying that based on all of the signs of that will precede Mashiach at the end of Saita, Nimtzaim anu ata bidara de ikvis de Mashiach mamish. We are now found in the last. We can already hear the footsteps of Mashiach. And in the words of my teacher, my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Asher hine oimed achar kreslenu. Frierdiker Rebbe cited these words constantly, that here Mashiach is literally standing behind the wall, and it's not a solid wall. There's already windows and there's cracks in this wall. We can see into the Messianic era. V'lachein drishas Hashem mikol echad hi sheyachin es atzmai v'eskol svivasai lekabbalas pnei Mashiach tzekenu. And therefore, what is necessary, like the Rebbe used to say to the children, the order of the day, the order of this time is that we should prepare ourselves and we should prepare our environment to welcoming Mashiach tzedkenu. Yesh ladas, the Rebbe says we have to know, sheba'avoida zu nidreshes zehirus kolos rizus yisera, that we have to be very careful. We have to be stringent with this avoida, special stringency. Va'af hanaz haguf. And this is interesting because there are a lot of people that are very involved in sichas that they at least understand in a way that indicates that now in the time preceding Mashiach, we have to put a lot of emphasis on our apartments, on dira and so on and so forth. And here the Rebbe says that we have to be careful, very careful in preparing ourselves, and that it also has to do with, it seems, not being so into the Gashmias. We have to have great stringency and great alacrity. We have to engage in this with tremendous devotion. Give it our all. When you're talking about katshe dairis, again, allegorically, the karbanos that will be brought up in every generation, the spiritual services that were true for generations, yesh makaim lavoida misuderes al pitam vadas. There you could be organized, you could do it logically. Shaba ein adam ma'abe legames mitziosei ishis. You don't lose your personal mitzias. You could do it at your, in the way that makes sense to you. Yesh tainu bedavar va'av hanas haguf. You could take pleasure in it. You could even have hana, physical hana, mea mitzvah, from the mitzvah you're doing, or in the service of Hashem, maybe, I don't know, in enjoying the davening, etc. But when it comes to what is the order of the time, of the day, of the hour, and that is to prepare for the coming of Mashiach, we have to know that this is an inyan that pushes aside all other inyanim, because it's an inyan shazman grama. This is what this time demands. v'tzarech kol adam lahashkiya atzmai v'koychosa b'zeh ba'ofen shelamayla memedid v'agbola. And we have to invest ourselves with all of our assets and all of our strength in a way that supersedes limitations. Ulies nason lekach kol kulei asher ta'abed mimenu mitzius ha'ishes b'dugmas shreifas hakorban. And we have to be so completely devoted until we lose really our self-control and how we feel about it. Like how the korban is completely burnt. V'zeh gufa yavias isgalus Mashiach tzedkenu, and this itself will bring the revelation of Mashiach sheyavi ba'ifin shel hesach hadas, that we're taught that Mashiach will come in hesach hadas, when we're not thinking about it. But a deeper way of understanding hesach hadas is l'mayla mevchinas hadas. It's beyond the limitations of cognition. Like it says in Tehillim, Matsasi David Avdi. Matsasi, I found. It wasn't something I could acquire through the normal ways. Matsasi, it's a transcendent level. I happened upon, I found Mashiach. B'ku'ula hamitis v'ashlema b'meheri yemenu mamish. And let this be with the complete and the true Geula, and may it be speedily in our days, literally. That is